Today is Saturday, September 2nd, 2017, and this is the morning session, the 9 a.m. session 2. Okay, so we begin with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, so yesterday we did an overview of the treatment of the 5 aggregates according to the Nikayas, particularly focusing on a selection of suttas from the Khanda Samyutta, the connected discourses on the aggregates. And now we come back to the Visuddhimagga. Okay, so now just to recapitulate this, I covered last night, but I'll just go through it again. So it's said here that the things classed as the aggregates, bases, elements, faculties, and so on, these are the soil of wisdom. So this is the ground in which one has to, in a sense, probe with the intellect, with one's faculty of knowledge, in order to absorb that material that is going to be the basis for investigation with insight. And so of these various groups of phenomena that are enumerated here, the one that we take up first, and that sort of is the most basic domain of investigation in the Buddha's teaching, is the set of the 5 aggregates. And so we have them enumerated here, the aggregate of materiality or rupa, material form, physical form, feeling, perception, the mental or volitional formations, and then the aggregate of consciousness. So of these 5, the first that we're going to be taking is the aggregate of material form. Probably the Buddha laid out the 5 aggregates in this particular sequence because they are moving from the grossest, the coarsest, in stages to the most subtle. And the one which is grossest, coarsest, most evident, easiest to observe is that of material form or matter. Okay, then, as I said last night, according to a sutta, it's said that the general characteristic of material form is here, this is Bhikkhu Nyanamoli, has translated that word rupana as being molested, which I don't particularly like. Particularly it conjures up images of, I have to say, of women being molested at work or by groping men and so forth. But the idea here is that matter is subject to being attacked, to being worn away, to be, I use the word deformation, which corresponds or brings in, we have the form there. So we could say it's called form because it's subject to deformation. And that Pali word is rupana. And as I explained last night, etymologically, in terms of origin, the word rupa and the word rupana really have nothing to do with each other. And I believe in Sanskrit one loses the connection between the two. But in Pali, rupana and rupa seem similar, and so as a word play, the texts explain rupa, materiality, material form, as having the characteristic of being deformed, of undergoing deterioration, harassment by cold and heat, mosquitoes and flies and so forth. So everything which has this characteristic of deformation is said to be included within the aggregate of material form. Okay, then going back even to the suttas state, I was trying to get that file. Okay, when the suttas bring up the question, what is material form, the standard answer is that it is the four great elements, and these four great elements are earth, water, fire, and air. So the four great elements and the material form derived from the great elements. But what's a bit of a puzzle is that in the suttas, one never finds a elaborate explanation, or actually any explanation, of what is meant by derived material form derived from the elements. It seems to be just taken for granted that one knows what it is. But the suttas also mention many other phenomena that apparently have a material nature, yet they are not simply the four great elements. And so what takes place in the Abhidhamma, and then continues in a work like the Visuddhimagga, is to incorporate all of those other material phenomena mentioned in the suttas, to incorporate them, to include them under this category of derived materiality, the material form derived from or dependent on the four great elements. And so it's said that when elaborating on this simple statement, okay, primary materiality, primary material form is of four kinds. That's the four great elements. And then derived material form is elaborated in terms of 24 kinds of secondary material phenomena, which we will come to later this morning. And so, when we look at the material form aggregate from the Abhidhammic point of view, in accordance with the suttas, one has primary matter, which is the four great elements, the four primary elements, and then the derived material form of these suttas is explained by way of 24 kinds of material form, 24 material phenomena. Okay, so when the Visuddhimagga comes to explaining the four primary elements, it doesn't explain them in this chapter on the five aggregates, because earlier in the section on the development of concentration, the text dealt with one of the meditation subjects is the analysis of the body into the four great elements. And so we find the treatment of the four great elements not in chapter 14, but in chapter 11. And so we have to jump back to chapter 11. Starting with section number 27. But here we are not going to be dealing with the actual meditation on the elements per se, but rather extracting from this chapter the treatment of the four great elements. Though in order to see how the section is treating the four great elements, we have to touch on the meditation to some extent. Okay, the Visuddhimagga draws on both the brief and detailed treatment of the meditation on the elements according to different suttas. So we have the brief treatment in the Satipatthana Sutta itself, and then the detailed treatment in a few other suttas, such as the Buddha's advice to his son Rahula. So the brief treatment we find in the Satipatthana Sutta, where the text says that a monk reviews this body, however it is placed, as consisting of elements, that in this body there are the earth element, the water element, the fire element, and the air element. And then the detailed treatment, as we find in several other suttas, is by looking at 42 aspects of the body and seeing how those 42 aspects can be divided up or analyzed according to the element which each represents. And here I have to give a word of explanation. Even though the sutta will classify certain parts of the body under one or another of these elements, as we're going to see, from the Abhidhamma point of view, all four elements are always bound up in every particle of matter. So the four elements are actually inseparable. But it's just that in certain parts of the body, one or another of these elements will be prominent, more conspicuous. And so when we take the earth element, this is the internal earth element. The earth element is found in the body. Then the explanation goes, whatever there is internally in oneself that is hard, and the text here uses the word harsh, though I would prefer to render that as coarse, and clung to, which here means acquired through karma, and then it enumerates some 20 parts of the body. Head hairs, body hairs, teeth, nails, skin, and so forth. So all of these 20 parts are components of the body in which the earth element is most prominent, and therefore they can be taken metaphorically, so to say, to represent the earth element. Even though in each of these, as we can see, there'll be the water element, the heat element, and the air element. Okay, so these 20 parts, and then whatever else there is internally in oneself that is hard or coarse and clung to, that is acquired through karma, that is the internal earth element. And then we could see that there'll also be the external earth element, which is anything outside ourselves, which has this quality of hardness, solidity, or coarseness. Okay, then the water element internally is represented by some 12 fluids of the body: bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, and so forth. So taking those 20 solid parts and the 12 fluid parts together, we would then get the 32 parts of the body that he used in the meditation on the repulsive or unattractive nature of the body. But in this meditation, we're not focusing on the aspect of repulsiveness or unattractiveness, but rather on the aspect of the elements. So we have here the earth element, the water element. Then we have the fire element. So whatever there is internally in oneself that is fire and fiery. And this doesn't mean that the body has to be on fire in order to see the fire element. So don't go jumping into a fire to say, in this way I'll get some idea of the fire element. But if you take a thermometer and put it in the mouth, and then take it out after a minute or so, you get a register of something like 98, 98.6 degrees. And then you look at the outside thermometer, which now might be 70, 72 degrees. So you see that the fire element in the body, right now, is more prominent than the fire element outside. If we were to go to Southern California now, and then look at the thermometer, it's been yesterday, I think it was 110 degrees. So then our fire element would be less than the fire element outside. And then when you get a fever, when the body feels like it's really burning, that is through the excitation or the escalation, the increase of the fire element. So that is when the body is burning up. And then it's also said that it's through the fire element that the body ages, that the signs of aging take place, that the skin starts to wrinkle, the hair turns gray. Teeth start to fall out, the faculties, the sense of sight and hearing become overripe, or start to lose their effectiveness. So this is said to occur through the gradual development of the fire element. And then the fire element is also responsible for digestion. In fact, this corresponds very much to modern science, which sees the process of digestion as a process by which the hydrochloric acid in the stomach sort of burns up the food and turns it into a pulp, which then gets assimilated in the intestines. So those are the four conspicuous aspects of the fire element: the natural temperature of the body, the flaring up of that bodily temperature and fever, the aging and decay of the body, and the digestion of the food. But then whatever else there is in the body that is fiery and clung to, that would also be representing or expressing, manifesting the fire element. Okay, then we come to the air element, the internal air element. And so whatever there is internally in oneself that is airy, not very helpful terms in themselves, but then the text gives the examples: upgoing winds, downgoing winds. And it occurred to me, perhaps this refers to the nerve currents. I believe they call it the efferent nerves and the afferent nerve currents. The efferent is the nerve currents which take data from the senses and convey them to the brain. And the afferent are the nerve currents that take, say, volitional decisions from the brain, or that occur in the mind through the brain, and then convey them through the body into forms of bodily expression. Then the winds in the belly, the air in the belly, winds in the bowels, it's the air in the bowels, the winds that course through all the limbs. Again, these might be taken in modern terms as nerve currents. And then probably the most obvious manifestation of the air element will be in-breathing and out-breathing. And then whatever else there is internally in oneself that is air, airy, and clung to, all of that is the internal air element. And then of course we can see these other three elements externally. The water, I mean, we see a horrific example of this now in Houston, southeast Texas, Louisiana. Also just recently in Bangladesh, India, Nepal, these torrential floods. We see the fire element externally when there's fire burning or external heat. And the air element is all around us. And we can notice it tactily through touch when there's a wind blowing. Okay, so this is basically the way the four elements are treated according to the sutta method. But now we come to the way that the four elements are explained or defined according to the Abhidharma method. So instead of taking the earth element to be simply what is hard or coarse and to be seen in concrete form in these particular organs and tissues, the earth element is defined as what has the characteristic, here the text uses the word stiffenness. It's not a very digestible word. I would use, the Pali is Tadabhava. So maybe a simpler rendering, we could call this stiffness rather than stiffenedness or coarseness. So that is the defining mark of the earth element. And it's sometimes said that we could see the earth element in the contrast between hardness and softness. So that would be a kind of continuum along which the earth element is strung out. So when there's a prominence of the earth element, it's manifest in hardness or solidity, that property of resistance, what resists the encroachment of other material particles. That is due to the earth element. And then as the earth element sort of diminishes along this spectrum, then its property shifts from hardness to softness. So between hardness and softness, we can see the scale of the earth element. Then the characteristic of the water element is said to be cohesion. That is, the water element is said to be that which is responsible for binding the solid particles of matter together. And perhaps the sort of empirical observation which led to that particular position came from observing how an Indian housewife prepares chapati or roti, the flatbread. She would take the wheat flour, spread it out on a flat surface, and if you just take the wheat flour together and say, I'm going to make a chapati with this, the particles of the wheat flour won't hold together. So what does she do? She takes a cup of water and then pours it over the wheat flour and starts kneading it together. And lo and behold, what happens? The wheat flour binds together until she gets a dough. Then she starts to knead it, and you get a dough. Then with we call this a rolling pin. You flatten it out and then put it in the oven or on the stove, then you get a chapati. So what holds the solid particles together is the water. And so from this is actually the way, in my mind, I'm reconstructing the way this particular conclusion was arrived at. The early teachers of the Abhidhamma maintained that the characteristic of the water element is cohesion or binding. Actually, the Pali word is abandana. And in bandana, you can see a distant connection to the English word binding. So the water element binds together the particles of matter in which the earth element is prominent, binds them so that they adhere together. And perhaps in terms of modern physics, well, I don't really have that background in physics, but perhaps the water element would be represented by those electronic forces which bind I'm stepping into steep water here. The subatomic particles, the neutrons, protons, and so forth, together into the nuclei of the atoms, and which bind the atoms together into molecules, and the molecules together into larger components. Okay, then the fire element is said to be that which has the characteristic of ripening or bringing to maturity. And probably the observation of this, or the observation that led to this conclusion, could have been observing what takes place when you leave fruit out in warm air. If you put the fruit in the refrigerator, it won't get ripe. It will remain fresh, fruit or vegetables, because it's cold. But when you leave that fruit out in the warm air, mangoes or apples, pears, because of the warmth, the fruit ripens. And if it's left out too long and we don't eat it, then it becomes overripe. And so it said the fire element has the aspect of ripening or bringing to maturity. And the air element has the characteristic of distending, that is, causing to expand, stretching out, enlarging. And probably an example of this would be if one takes a balloon and then blows into it and fills it with air, the balloon expands. And if one is driving the car and then the tire starts to go flat, in order to fill up the tire, one has to pump air into the tire. And we could see this also in breathing. As we take the air into the lungs expand and the chest becomes distended. And then as we breathe out, when the lungs expel the air, then the lungs contract and the chest collapses. So we could actually say expansion and contraction is the continuum of the earth element, of the air element. And so it's said that in the meditation on the elements, that a practitioner who has quick or sharp understanding, sharp faculty of understanding or sharp wisdom, who wants to practice the meditation on the element, doesn't have to go through the body in terms of hairs of the head, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin, and so forth, but is simply able to grasp the defining characteristics of the four elements, and then is able to scan the body, so to speak, run through the body and pick up the sensed presence, the sensations that represent the four elements. So one could scan the body in terms of its stiffness or hardness and recognize that as the earth element. One could experience the cohesion or the flowing of the fluids of the body and experience that as the water element. One could directly experience the warmth and heat of the body as the fire element, and then through recognition of the expansion and contraction or movement, one sees that as the air element. Okay, then the text here, it gives a detailed explanation of each part of the body, which we'll skip over. Okay, now this is the interesting part. So another method of doing the meditation on the elements is that one takes each of the components, starting with the 20 components of the body that normally represent the earth element. And here, one will see that within each of those components, for example, we'll take the fingernails, for example. That which has the characteristic of stiffness or hardness or solidity, that one defines as the earth element. Okay, within those fingernails, there's also the cohesion of the particles of earth element. That cohesion one defines as the water element. Again, within the fingernails, there is some degree of warmth, and perhaps it's that warmth that's responsible for the growth of the fingernails, so every so often one has to clip them. So that characteristic of warmth is the presence of the fire element. And then there's some distension, maybe not so evident in the fingernails, I'm afraid. But if distension is taken as movement, maybe that gradual growth of the fingernails, though normally invisible to us, could be taken to represent the air element. And so within these 20 parts, which at the gross level represent the earth element, we can see that the four primary elements are all present. They are all there bound together. Okay, then if we take the 12 parts representing the water element, so let us take, okay, for argument's sake, we'll take maybe the most clearly evident. I'll take the saliva. So within that saliva, though it's liquid, it's a fluid, but there's some base of solidity in the particles of the saliva. So those particles that make up the saliva, the base of solidity, is the earth element. Their cohesion or their flowing nature is the water element. Their warmth is the fire element. And again, the distension is not so obvious, but maybe if I gather a lump of saliva in my mouth, then I feel it expand. That would be the presence of the air element. And maybe if I spit it out and I see that it's all bubbly, the bubbles in the saliva would be the obvious presence of the air element. Okay, now in this portion, the text is going to look at the way the four elements function together, how each one contributes its own role to maintaining this conglomeration or assemblage of the four primary elements. And so if we take in the body the earth element, we see this body, which might be 5'6" tall. Some people 6 feet tall. 5 feet 6 inches tall. Some people might be 6 feet tall, 5 feet 2 tall, of various weights. It seems to be quite large and solid. But if we take the earth element in the body and isolate it from the contribution of the other elements, and we reduce it to fine dust, it said it might amount to an average dona measureful. A dona might be something like a cup. So the solid matter, the earth element in the body, just like a cup. Again, this seems to correspond a bit to what scientists tell us, that 90% of the body is water, 97%. So the earth element in the body is very slight, and yet when it's blown up by the presence of the water element, it could stand so tall and take up so much space. And it's held together by the water element, which measures half as much, just half of a cup. So how you get the 6-foot body, I don't know. Okay, then it's maintained by the fire element, and then it's distended or expanded, expands and contracts through the operation of the air element. And then in this way, through the cooperation or collaboration of these four elements, we have bodies that might be small, big, tall, short, tough, rigid, soft, and so on. Okay, now it's said that the function of the earth element is to serve as a foundation for the other three elements, and in fact for all other types of material phenomena. The earth element is called the foundation. The Pali word is patita. So the earth element serves as the foundation. And then the water element, being founded or grounded on the earth element and so forth, has this mode of cohesion. And because the water element is based on the earth element, it doesn't trickle or run away. Okay, it's the fire element that cooks what is eaten, drunk, and so on, and which maintains this body and ensures its proper appearance. And then the air element is what distends this body, preventing it from collapsing, which enables the body to stand erect, and which is also responsible for motion. So it's the air element that will propel the body forward when we walk forward, and it's the air element that's said to enable us to extend the limbs, to bend them in, to wriggle the hands and feet and so on. All of that is coming through the air element. Again, perhaps because the air element is representing these these currents flowing through the nerves. Okay, so here again we come to this scheme of characteristic, function, and manifestation. So the earth element has the characteristic of hardness. Its function is to serve as a foundation. The water element has the characteristic of trickling or flowing. I don't quite understand why it says the function is to intensify, but better, I would say the function of the water element is to bind together, to hold together. Here that is given as the manifestation. Sometimes these stipulations don't make good sense to me, so I have to revise them according to my own understanding. And then it's said that the air element has the characteristic of distending, and its function is to cause motion. Okay, then there should be something on section 105. Yeah, this is the important point, that as to resolution and non-resolution, in terms of their position or the space they occupy, the four elements are inseparable. They always, as I said earlier, they are always bound to each other. One can't physically separate, cut through a material particle and separate out, this is the earth element, that is the water element, that's the fire element. But they are actually always inseparable. And actually it's the particles of the earth element which are bound together. What binds them is the water element, and what maintains some degree of temperature. Anything above absolute zero is the presence of the fire element. And any material particle will have some distension, will be in a process of expanding and contracting. Even the subatomic particles are constantly fluctuating back and forth. That motion, vibration, oscillation is the function of the air element. And so each of these is said to be a condition for the others. So the earth element is a condition for the other three by acting as their foundation. The water element is a condition for the other three by binding them together, causing their cohesion. The fire element is what maintains them, matures them, ripens them, and the air element acts as their distension and is responsible for their motion, their movement. Okay, so that covers our treatment of the four great elements, the four primary elements. Now I'll ask whether there's any questions before we go further on the four primary elements. Okay, Dina, Venerable, Sudaso. Okay, begin.
Bhante,
Yeah.
hi, I'm Dina. We just meditated on the 32
That was like a
elements.
couple of weeks ago, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, for me it's just. And now you mentioned there's 42. Then you mentioned there's 20. I don't understand
Okay.
how it correlates.
Okay. The 32 are actual components of the body. So those are the parts that are considered to be disagreeable, repulsive, unattractive. So those 32 are used in the meditation on the unattractive nature of the body. But there are 42 aspects of the body. The aspects of the fire element and the air element, they're not repulsive, they're not unattractive. So they don't come in, and they're not actual concrete things, so to speak, the way the tissues and the fluids are. So they don't come into the meditation for the unattractive nature of the body, but they come into the meditation on elements.
And the 20?
Excuse me?
You mentioned that, then you
The
mentioned
20 are the 20 solid
20
parts.
parts.
Yeah. Those are the 20 parts representing the earth element.
Thank you.
12 parts represent the water element.
Thank you.
Okay. Do you have a microphone there? Okay, please let him take the microphone. Let's see. Let me see. Well, just speak it loudly.
Bhante, so my question is about, under the sutta mention of the elements, it says that each one is what's clung to. It's And I'm a bit uncomfortable with this explanation of clung to as acquired through kamma. So while that might technically be true, it seems to me, I believe the word is upadina, from upadana.
Yeah.
It's like something that there's attachment to.
Yeah.
So the way I would read that is that it sounds to me like it's more talking about what there's currently attachment towards.
Yeah, that's the way one might think the term means based on its etymological derivation. But, I mean, I don't have the time to go searching through the text now, but I think that there's enough evidence from the way that word is used that it means what has been acquired through past clinging. And it functions pretty much in the text as meaning effectively organic matter as opposed to inorganic matter.
Thank you.
Okay. One, and then Richard, then we'll have to stop. Please say your name.
Yes, Bhante, Elena.
You're right, Elena, that's right, yeah.
You just mentioned that there are 42 aspects of the body that are not the repulsive aspects.
No, what I said is that there are 42 aspects of the body. Of those 42, 32 aspects or components come within the meditation on the unattractive nature of the body. Yeah.
Okay, so it doesn't mean that we have 74 aspects of the body altogether. We have 42.
No.
42 out of which
Yeah,
32 are.
There are 32 which are the unattractive parts, then 4 aspects representing the fire element, and 6 aspects representing the air element. So that 4 and that 6, them together with the 32, and we get 42.
Thank you, Bante.
Okay.
Hi, Bante. My
Oh.
name is Min.
Min,
I have a question about the purpose of the study of the 4 elements. Like we know our body is made of 4 elements as basis. But at what point, if we meditate, then we will drop the idea of self?
What point in
like,
meditating
yes,
on the body?
like we learn it, I still can drop the idea of myself because I know, okay, I understand I build of 4 elements.
Yeah.
But at what point my idea of self
Yeah.
get
Gets
dropped?
Eliminated?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, one can't give a simple answer to that question, but what one does with the meditation on the 4 elements is to meditate first on these. One gets a sense of the elements as constituting the body, and then if we look at the Buddha's, especially in the discourse to Rahula, he explains that this internal earth element and the external earth element are both together simply the earth element. And similarly with the water element and water element in the body, the water element external to the body, the fire element internal to the body, the fire element external to the body, air element internal to the body, air element outside the body, both are simply the water element, fire, air element. And so in this way, we're building up a sense of what I would call the impersonal nature of the body, that there's this constant exchange of materials between the outer world, physical substance coming into the body, we eat food, the food gets digested, the food becomes parts of our body, there's undigested parts of food which get expelled from the body and become perhaps fertilizer for plants that grow and maybe become vegetables, which again become food. And so in this way, one could contemplate the non-self nature of the body, and then, of course, one has to develop insight through the progressive stages of insight. And then when that insight reaches maturity, then it will eliminate the sense of I or self that adheres to the body.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Richard, you could stand up.
Yeah, 2 things. One, I don't understand the relationship between the idea of particles and the idea of inseparability. It seems to me they're mutually exclusive. As we have particles, they're separable. If you don't have particles, they may be inseparable. Yeah. And I think this has something to do with the fact that the idea of element is being used also for heat, which is more likely motion, right? And things like, other things like air, which isn't one substance, and so on. Yeah. But in the Greek and Roman traditions, as the people who believed in particles, the atomists like Democritus, Leucippus, and Epicurus, and Lucretius, they did not believe in inseparability, right? And that's what it's a curious mixture. Yeah. So can you explain why this happens? Why do you get these inseparable particles? Just what does that mean?
Well, actually, I would say that the particles are the particles of the earth element, but they are bound together by the water element. The water element is considered to be that which binds together the particles of the earth element. And then these particles bound together by the water element have heat. The heat is inherent in them. And then the whole thing is in the state of oscillation or motion, which is the function of the air element.
Yeah, but I mean, but then what do you do with the fact that you can drive the water element out by heating it? Right, you can dry out mud, for instance. You know,
then
wouldn't that seem to prove separability?
Okay, these are complex questions. I don't really want to get into an extensive philosophical discussion.
Well, I have one more question. I don't understand why
the questions
is this
really have to be concerned with clarifying things that might not be understood, rather than raising sort of philosophical objections. I don't have time.
Well, I can't understand it without this. I'm sorry. It doesn't make sense to me. The other thing is I don't understand why it's in the concentration chapter.
Yeah, actually, this is the meditation on the elements can be used both to gain a kind of minimal degree of concentration, but then really the proper place for the meditation on the elements as in part of the process of developing insight. So the meditation on the elements will again be brought in, I believe it's in chapter 18 of the Visuddhimagga, where one comes to the systematic development of insight. Okay, please.
Yes. Hi. Bhante, this is Milind again. We have 4 elements. They are in the different state of matters.
Yeah.
But is there any other thing that's coordinating all those?
I don't understand the question.
So all the state of matters, the solid, liquid, gases, and energy, as we call them, a different state.
Yeah.
Versus the 4 elements defined. I'm kind of correlating all those. What is changing one state to another state?
What?
The 4 state of matters, earth, water, gas, air, and energy or heat.
Yeah.
Within our body, they are being transformed.
Yeah.
Is there an entity that's doing that?
Is there anything that's doing that?
Is there an entity that's doing that?
An entity that's doing that? No, this is all occurring on its own, just in accordance with the natural functioning of matter.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, way in the back, far in the back.
My name is Margot, and I have a question for you about the magic trick. It's referred to in that section 92, saying that the mechanism of elements carries on like a magic trick, deceiving foolish people with the male and female sex. And I'm wondering what connection there might be with the reference to a magic trick in the Samyutta Nikaya. If it's just the same imagery or if there's a way to understand those together.
Yeah, perhaps the idea here, and I'm not sure the intention of this, is that consciousness is said to be like a magical illusion, because consciousness is seen to be that which interprets this combination of the 4 elements, which is carrying on, which interprets this as being a person, a self, who is identified here as being male and female, and so on. And so it's this deceptive functioning of, on the one hand, it's the deceptive functioning of consciousness through its thought processes that brings up these wrong identifications. Yet on the objective side, it's I would say, the solid appearance of the elements when they come together, because we don't dissect the material phenomena into the elements, that the material elements are able to deceive the mind into taking things as being solid, concrete, substantial wholes, rather than conglomerations of the elements. Okay, maybe we could have time for one more question, then we'll have to take a break. Is it see you? No? Oh, I thought I saw. Okay, please, she'll bring the microphone for you.
My name is Peg. In the discussion of the elements, is there any touching on the force of gravity or magnetism?
I believe gravity was discovered in the 18th century, at least identified in the 18th century by Isaac Newton.
I mean, just that sort of thing that would attract matter to the Earth or to other.
A force of attraction between material.
Like magnetism, where two things come together.
I believe in some texts that there is reference to the magnetic phenomena, but no, I don't think that there's any reference to a force that attracts material bodies to each other the way gravity is said to do. Okay, it's 10:10 now, so we can take, how long is the break that we had here? Oh, the break was supposed to be at 10 o'clock. Wow. I've overstepped my entitlement. Okay, so can we make it a 10-minute break? Because I want to cover the 24 types of derived matter in a short period of time, in 1 hour. Okay, so we'll have a 10-minute break. And you could get up